Great. Welcome back. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Dave from Wendy, one of the organizers of the Recruitment Automation Conference. I am so incredibly excited about this panel and discussion that we're about to have. This is something that Frida, who is the CEO and founder of Pymetrics, when we were putting together this conference, this was a conversation that we wanted to have from the outset. And I am as happy today as I have ever been that we started that conversation. I think these conversations are happening everywhere across the conference, but none so more direct and important as this is today. So with that, I will stop talking. I will let Frida introduce herself and take the panel away, and everyone should enjoy. Thanks. Conversations are happening everywhere across the conference, but none so more direct and important.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Today. With that, I will stop talking. I will let Frida introduce herself and take the panel away.
Sorry, I think there was some audio confusion. I apologize for that. So anyways, really wonderful to be here today. Thank you so much, Dave, for that introduction. I'm Frida Polli. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Pymetrics, which uses behavioral science and artificial intelligence to help make hiring decisions both more predictive and more fair. And I would love for our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe Adrianne, we can start with you, and then Lori.
Sure. Thanks so much, Frida. I'm Adrianne Pettiford, and I'm a research psychologist by training, developmental psychologist, and I lead our client insights and analytics team at Pymetrics. And prior to joining Pymetrics, I was leading investigative analytics at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So I kind of come to this world of technology through the lens of a social scientist who's been very focused on fairness, diversity, inclusion.
And hi, everyone. My name is Lori Foster. I'm a advisor and research partner to Pymetrics. I'm also a professor of industrial and organizational psychology at North Carolina State University, where I oversee the 4D lab, which focuses on research at the intersection of work, psychology, technology, and development. Really happy to be here today.
Fantastic. Thank you both for joining the panel. So, there's, I think now more than ever, a real interest that people have on, sort of how we can improve upon the areas of diversity and inclusion. So, I'd like to just start out in terms of, we think a lot around why is it so hard for us to train our brains to not be biased. So, I have my own thoughts around this as a cognitive neuroscientist in terms of, sort of the processes that make that challenging, but wanted to throw this out to the two of you. You have probably different perspectives on why it's so challenging. Adrianne, do you want to take that?
Sure. Well, so absolutely. Thank you, Frida. And it's a really great question, because when we think about what bias does for us, we have to remember that it's actually quite functional and adaptive. So when you're thinking about navigating the world and making decisions about what you're going to do, whether that's go up a flight of stairs or eat dinner or, interact with individuals, you have to have some sort of quick structures in mind, mental structures in mind that help you make those decisions so that you're not doing this very slow and taxing deliberative thinking. So for example, if you see an object that's got 4 legs and a flat surface, you're going to make the assumption that it's a table, right? You don't need to really study it and decide that. That's where you're going to rest your lunch. And then you need to decide if an object is edible or inedible, and that's going to be based on certain properties that it has. So that's very functional and adaptive when we think about just kind of navigating everyday life without having to slow down and think consciously about things. But the problem with that is those things, those very same things that we begin learning from infancy that become entrenched, unfortunately, sometimes we can learn biases that aren't as adaptive and functional. But again, they take us a very long time to learn and program. So that's why they're also so hard to unlearn, because we spend a lifetime learning them.
Exactly. And I think, David Kahneman's work on thinking fast, thinking slow is very apropos in this discussion, Adrianne, because you're really talking about the fast sort of instinctual system where bias, comes from, as opposed to more the sort of slow contemplative system. Lori, any thoughts on that? Additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, of course, we're capable of both. And where this rears its head in the employment context, actually, it rears its head every day. But particular to this conversation, an example is when a hiring manager is, faced with a stack of resumes, right? I mean, a decision needs to be made, and a decision often needs to be made relatively quickly. And of course, we're quite capable of the more slow, deliberative type of thinking that Daniel Kahneman refers to as system two thinking. It's just that we don't use it all the time, right? And so the idea is that we as human beings can toggle between the system two, it's conscious, it's deliberate, it's slow, versus the system one that Adrianne was talking about, quick, instinctual. But when we're going about our everyday lives and needing to make quick decisions, we're often going to revert to those mental shortcuts, those heuristics, like Adrianne is talking about, where things like familiarity start to impact us, even in ways that we don't realize, or things like similarity tend to impact us beyond our conscious, awareness. And that's where the problems come into play. So I think that we need to design systems that are wired for our system one thinking, rather than expecting people to engage in that deliberative thinking all day, every day.
And that leads me into my next question for the both of you. What does work for combating bias, particularly in the hiring and work context? Adrianne, you want to give us your thoughts on that one?
Sure, absolutely. So if we kind of take the example of learning from humans, because we're talking about thinking and decision making, in the same way that if you slow down and walk a person through their decision making and you inform the information that they're using to make a decision, we can do the same thing in hiring. The difference here being that we can be explicit about the components and facts and information that goes into decision making in ways that we really can't when we're talking about human decision making. And so when we're looking at the hiring process, and we're talking about recruitment automation here, when we're looking at the hiring process, what that means is we can build out tools that have very explicit variables that go into them. And if they're not included in that list of explicit variables, then an algorithm, for example, won't take them into consideration for decision making, which means what we can do is we can go in, start with a list of things, variables. Maybe it is prior experience, or maybe it's the way someone responds to a particular behavioral task. And we can look at that pattern responding, and we can determine whether or not there are any demographic differences that we might want to isolate or remove. So that's really one of the, I think, promises to this technology, is that we can actually look at that list of what we've put in there. We can audit it before we even use it, really. And then after we've used it, we can continue to test and tweak, because really as individuals, we change and we evolve. So similarly, there's also possibilities for bias in the variables that we're using to become more or less biased over time.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. What you're I think if I summarize that. Lori.
Yeah, so I think we might have lost you for a moment there, Frida. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. So, I think you had asked the question around what works, and I'll start with maybe what doesn't work as well as we would hope. I think there's a temptation to say, okay, recruiter, okay, hiring manager, like stop that, right? Stop picking people on the basis of how similar they are to you or how familiar they feel or seem. And it's tempting to do that and to send them to a diversity training program or something to try to train their brains out of that bias. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of evidence that that's the great solution of the century, because it is hard to rewire our brains. So I think that what does work, I like the way that Iris Bonet puts it. In fact, her book is called What Works. She says, instead of trying to debias our brains, we need to debias our systems and our processes. And that's why I like what Adrianne was saying, because that is something that doesn't require people to do something that's not natural to them. It enables them to do what they're good at, and it provides tools and data to supplement and to help that decision-making process. It designs for system one.
Absolutely. And just on that note then, when we're thinking about implementing processes or systems that are mitigating bias, what are some of the things that we should think about, and would love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I'm happy to respond to that one first. I think we've been talking about this slow and deliberative thinking, and I think that's where we really ought to start. So like Lori, we have some folks who have spent their careers studying IO psychology, and then like myself, folks who have spent their careers studying fairness and diversity. We can take the time to be very slow and deliberative and think about what are the things that matter. Right? So bringing people to the table who have spent time understanding the things that matter. So it may be, what are the things that are predictive of on-the-job performance? Is you would work with an IO psychologist to understand, but then you also might work with someone like myself to understand what are the things that might actually operate as proxies for demographics that we really don't want to get in there. So we can take the time to start from the slow deliberative place and then build that into an algorithm. I think when we're doing that also, we really ought to be looking at variables and components that we can measure that start from kind of a level playing field or that are broadly relevant. So we wouldn't want to start from a place where bias is kind of already well known and seen. And then once you do that, I think it's really on the shoulders of both the people who develop and design these tools, as well as those people who are implementing them, to keep an eye on it. So in the same way a kid, I have a 4-year-old child, so it's relevant to me. In the same way a kid outgrows their shoes, at the time that you buy the shoes, they fit quite well and they're perfect. With these assessments and hiring tools, as the roles change, as the culture of the organization changes, so too does your hiring approach need to change. So you'll want to keep an eye on monitoring things, even if you've audited before you've gone live. You just want to keep a pulse on things to make sure that things remain fair and consistent and compliant, not only with legal regulations, but scientific best practices.
Lori, what would you add to that? Very thorough.
I love it. It was music to my IO psychology ears. So yes, and yes, in terms of, kind of defining what's important for success in the job and then figuring out a good way to measure it. Maybe one thing that I'll add is then also thinking about when you're administering those assessments, how it's being framed. So for our viewers who have studied psychology will know about a concept called stereotype threat. That is the self-affirming apprehension that one's going to be evaluated negatively based on a negative stereotype. And it sometimes leads people to perform worse than what they're capable of. So thinking about how to frame the assessments in a way that's is not as threatening, but in a way is, we all want to find the right fit for you. And that's what this is about. I think can go a long way in terms of helping people reach their potential in the assessment itself, in addition to finding the right job that's the right fit for them.
And, I think all excellent points. I think one thing that you brought up, Adrianne, which I think is really important to consider, is this idea of proxy variables. You didn't call them proxy variables, but I think it would be great if you could just speak to that a little bit, because I think one of the concerns people have in algorithm development is, okay, it's fine that you're not looking at, race or gender, but there could be variables in the data that are proxy variables, and then people get into all sorts of trouble. So do you want to just speak a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, exactly. So interestingly, there was a project that I worked on at EEOC where when we actually didn't have gender or race data, we could use other information to within 90% accuracy estimate that missing information. Right? So if you tell me someone's last name or their zip code, I can tell you with 90% accuracy what race they are. If you tell me someone's first name and the year they were born, I can tell you with a considerable amount of accuracy what gender they are. Sometimes they're clear-cut proxies like that. Sometimes they're things like name of university, or in a resume, it might be the extracurricular activity that someone participates in. Those can all be proxies that we could overlook if we're not careful.
And so what would be your recommendations for people that are thinking about building algorithms and are concerned about, am I going to introduce proxy variables without knowing? Because I think a lot of times people are worried that AI is so powerful that these proxy variables are going to be introduced without me knowing it. And now what do I do? So what thoughts do you have about that?
Yes, I think it's kind of a combination. There was a really great talk earlier in the conference that spoke to ethics and thinking about the transparency and the importance of transparency. So if you start from a place where you already know what's going in, it's a lot easier to isolate the things that could be problematic. And when you start auditing and pre-testing, meaning taking advantage of technology that we have now to use example or simulated data sets, and run your algorithms through those data sets where we know the demographic characteristics, and we can actually look to see if there are patterns where you see some groups performing better or worse than others. And that typically can tune you into things that are inadvertent proxies for demographic variables.
Yep, that's a great point. And, you know, and one other thing that I'd love for both of you to weigh in on is the importance of representation within the training sets. This is something that we at Pymetrics know this challenge well. You know, Lori, Adrianne, what do you think about sort of best practices in terms of when you're training algorithms? What are some ways that we can ensure representation as much as possible? Starting with you, Lori.
Sure. Well, Adrianne might have more specific thoughts on that one than I do, but I will say, piggybacking on what Adrianne was saying a moment ago, I think that's the nice thing about algorithms, is that it's not that they can't be biased. Obviously they can. There have been instances where they have been, but they can be scrutinized, right? Yep. Whereas human beings, this way of thinking that we were talking about at the beginning of the conversations, are inscrutable. Yep. It's really difficult to know whether actual bias is occurring, when and how. And so I think that that's an important piece of the conversation, is this idea that we can even, you know, open up the black box and look at the training sets and look at the proxies like Adrianne was talking about.
Yeah. And Adrianne, I mean, we've had lots of experience dealing with, you know, representative and unrepresentative data sets. So do you want to speak from your position of expertise on the subject?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we can sometimes get caught up in, even when we're really well-intentioned about trying to strive for increased diversity, is that we forget that if we're starting from a place with low diversity, even if we value the characteristics in that relatively homogeneous group, if we're not careful, we can develop an algorithm that's really super duper narrowly defined and fine tuned to that small subgroup of people. And then when we go to apply it to a broader, more diverse population, it really isn't quite good at picking out the things that we think that matter most. So to give you an example, if we're attempting to sort out, you know, if you're thinking about the square peg and round hole game that you play as a child, if you're moving through that exercise and trying to find the circle and put that shape in there, you can do that if you have a circle there. But if the circle is missing, when you encounter the circle for the first time, you're just not going to make it fit. You will not find a successful outcome for that circle because you did not have that circle in your population to start with. So if we're not careful, we can build tools out that really aren't great at measuring everyone, because when they were designed, they didn't include everyone.
And so what recommendations do you have in situations of, you know, sort of homogeneity and low diversity, which, you know, is not a hypothetical, it's a real situation? What sort of best practices would you recommend in those cases?
Yes, I think the best step is always to ask why before you get going. So you want to uncover the source of that homogeneity. So when we think about building algorithms and choosing the things that go into algorithms, we really want to start from a place of making sure that these things are fair. Right? So if we're going to use an indicator, let's make sure that it's fair. So if you're saying, I would like all the people in my organization who are top salespeople, but what you find is that given the structure of your sales schedules, women who have children are unable to keep up with that. You'll find that their sales figures are lower. And if you're not careful, you'll make the assumption that they're not top performers. So what you can then do is you can go back and say, you know what, that's not the right metric that we should be using to measure performance. And you need to find something that's more inclusive and more adaptive. So I'd say start with challenging what you're building off of. And then from there, trying to expand the representation in your group. Fortunately, we do have really talented data scientists in the field who can actually leverage a bunch of other statistical and modeling approaches that can help account for those gaps when you just don't have diversity. So I think leveraging the full suite of tools, everything from starting with changing what you're measuring to trying to better approximate a full distribution of variety in your sample.
I think it's a great point. You know, moving a little bit away from selecting talent, which is obviously something that we think about a lot, would love to get your thoughts on, you know, can technology be helpful with inclusion, or do we think that that's an area where technology might have more limitations than in the area of talent acquisition? Just curious to hear.
So I'm happy to take a stab at that one. I think I'm a little biased because I am a head of analytics. And so I always start with the value that we can get just by taking a look at our present situation, doing just descriptive, broad search of the landscape, inventorying the situation, looking at where you're seeing individuals of underrepresented groups kind of fall out of the ranks in your organization is a really great place to start. And there's a ton of technology that can help you do that. Some of those might be already baked into your human resources information system or applicant tracking if we're talking about where we lose people in the funnel. There are also other technology tools that not only help us identify where we're seeing issues of inclusion, but those that can help us increase inclusion. So we do have tools that leverage the power of natural language processing that can look at, for example, differences in performance appraisals or communication patterns on email for you to see who in your organization is more or less networked. And then once you have you've identified those patterns, then that gives you an opportunity to step in and interact. So for example, one of those tools that we see with, for example, Slack that could be leveraged is, you know, just making some connections automatically, being able to leverage tools that can pair individuals who are from underrepresented groups with mentors and sponsors.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
I
think those are great ideas. I think that partnering with academics in a lot of cases can go a long way. Scott Tony-Dandel at UNC Charlotte has been doing some really interesting research along the lines, Adrianne, of what you've been talking about, identifying fault lines, for example, in communication. Is just one small example of how I think we've got better tools now with the technology and data science than we've ever had before in terms of being able to detect not just things like who's getting promoted, where are they dropping off, you know, who are we retaining after that point of hire, which are all very important and critical starting point, but to go even deeper. And so if that analytic talent doesn't exist in your organization, I think there are a lot of academics out there who are interested in that just for the sheer sake of the question and would be willing to partner.
Yeah. And, you know, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's an important question to ask. You know, a lot of people feel like it's wonderful that we have all this technology, you know, but isn't it a bit dehumanizing? Isn't it saying something negative about human beings to say that we need this technology? Why isn't it possible to, why do we need technology? And why can't we do without it? I mean, human beings, you know, should have the capacity to not need to rely on all this technology. And I mean, I have my own opinions about this, but I would just be curious to hear your thoughts about that, because we get that question a lot. And I think it's an important one to ask, especially at a recruitment automation conference. So, Adrianne, do you want to take it away?
Sure. So I think, you know, we shouldn't get too wound up about using technology to help us do things better. I think there's always going to be space for humans in recruiting and HR. I think it's just important that we acknowledge that sometimes as we're improving the human condition, that we can leverage technology to fill in the gaps while we're working to get there. So I like to remain optimistic that we can use these tools that will help us increase diversity, help people gain a seat at the table. And then once they're there and they show up and they demonstrate their competence, with time, those biases that we're fighting against will actually begin to change.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that I'm optimistic too, but technology at the end of the day is neutral. You know, I don't think it's either good or bad. It's how we use it and what we do with it. And so certainly there are some things that people do better than technology and vice versa. First of all, it's figuring out what we're good at, where we could use some help, and then building the technology in a way that is ethical and that's, you know, achieving the greater societal aims that we're looking to achieve. So I think that's a big part of it.
And I also think that, you know, one thing that is really important to note is that, you know, technology is really, I think, a mirror that holds a mirror up to us, right? And a lot of the examples we've had of AI gone bad are bad because we don't like what it's done, but it's also reflected back a mirror to us to say we need to do better. And I think that that's super important now more than ever to have that mirror to say, do I like what I see? And rather than adopting the approach of, well, I don't want to use technology because it might uncover something that I'm not super happy about, I think that's the wrong approach. I think use the technology to really force us to confront some things that we might not be that excited about, right? And try to change those things. So that's how I see technology is as a mirror that, you know, sometimes really shines back uncomfortable truths for all of us, for myself, for everyone. But it's a really important tool in the sort of continual improvement process because I think at the end of the day, bias is a way that we do not see someone's true potential. I mean, at the end of the day, it is limiting us from seeing the true potential that all of human beings have. It behooves us all to remove that bias. It's not just better for certain demographic groups to remove the bias. It's better for everybody because it unleashes the real potential of humankind. And so I would argue that the right way is to go down the path of accountability, transparency, and then if we don't like what we see and if we don't like what we find, going about changing it. So
I agree 100%. And, you know, I think another reason why technology is necessary in many of these cases is because it's scalable, right? Yep. I mean, if a lot of us want to see change and we want to see big change and we want to see it soon, like now. Mm-hmm. And if we're relying on changing a whole bunch of hearts and minds, even if that were possible, it would take a really, really, really long time. Whereas technology, you know, if we get this right, I think can be scaled quickly and it can enable that change at a much larger scale that's so desperately needed.
Left here really important for this lens to think about in terms of when applying recruitment automation and how to do this in a way that's diversity friendly. Adrianne, I'll let you start us off with our final words.
I'm sorry, but I missed the first part of that question. So if the broad question is how can we be mindful of using these technologies in a diversity-friendly way, my response to that is really bringing a multidisciplinary team to the table. Folks who are implementing these tools and technologies at their organizations, of course, you need to have business-minded folks at the table who understand what's going on in your business and the roles and what's included in those roles. But also, if you are working only with the folks inside your business, you're really losing out on the expertise of other fields that have some relevant information. For example, IO psychologists, you'll want to consult with folks who understand ethics and compliance, folks who understand diversity in general. And so I'd say, think about it from a very holistic perspective. Don't just grab the first data scientist that you see and ask them to build you something. You really want to sit down at the table and have a well thought out, well-rounded understanding of not only what the tool needs to accomplish, but all of the parameters in which it needs to operate in and the possible positive outcomes and possible negative outcomes.
Yep, great points. Lori, any final words for our audience?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. What Adrianne said, the multidisciplinary nature of this is truly important when we're considering the ethical edges of it and also the technical edges. So having the engineers, the data scientists, the ethicists, the IO psychologists side by side, I think is truly critical. And I also would say, you know, again, like, getting the research out there, right? Mm-hmm. So putting it into, to the extent that it's possible within a company setting, putting it out there into the public domain so that we can learn from each other is something that I've always appreciated about Pymetrics and something that I value and I think is important.
Yep. And I think just on that last point, Lori, I think, it would be really great if you could say 2 words about the research that we've done around Opportunity Youth with Hyatt, because I think that was such a compelling case study on how this technology can really be used to serve the underserved. Do you want to give us a sort of high-level overview of that?
Sure. I'll try to be quick. So this one was, we were really excited to co-win the Wharton People Analytics Conference white paper competition with this one. And also, it was just a project that was near and dear to our heart. But essentially, it was taking Opportunity Youth, or NEETs, youth who are not in education, employment, or training, whom, by the way, are disproportionately coming from demographic minorities, and finding a way to reconnect them to the world of work using analytics, as we've been talking about. This was a partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation and Hyatt. Rockefeller Foundation is very interested in double impact hiring. That's both good for the bottom line financially and good for people. So what we did was, with the help of Hyatt and community-based organizations, we're able to identify a large group of youth who were not in education, employment, or training, and think about how to connect them to open job opportunities. Hyatt has got a wonderful program called Rise High, where they opened up 5 very different roles. So we're talking like bell desk attendant versus entry-level culinary versus like a housekeeping, etc. And we started using Pymetrics to model what success looks like in each of those roles. And guess what? It looked really different. Like, the profile of what's needed for a waiter waitress is different from the entry-level culinary, etc. Yep. Which was good news to us, because we had just this beautiful array of human beings in front of us who were interested in work. And so once we had the model for each of those 5 different roles, we were able to invite these Opportunity Youth to play the Pymetrics games. This is the part where I was really skeptical. Already, these youth were, by definition, disengaged. Are we ever going to get them to, sit down and take an assessment? And the answer was yes. I was very happy to report that more than 1/3 of those invited took the assessments, resulting in hundreds of youth who were assessed using the Pymetrics games, and more than 95% of them matched to at least one role. There's a fit for everybody. It makes a world of difference.
Exactly. I think we're at time. I must confess, I'm slightly confused, but hopefully everyone got what they needed out of this. And I believe we're at time, Sarah. So I think we're going to be passing on to the next session.